Vox has a popular video called Why the Myers-Briggs Test is Totally Meaningless. But is it really? The video declares that the test is meaningless. Their justification for this is that clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, anyone working to understand human behavior who doesn't have a stake in the financial success of this test doesn't actually even believe in it. Is this claim true? It's certainly overstated. Of course it's wrong that no clinical psychologists or psychiatrists support it. The claim should rather read that the Myers-Briggs isn't popular with clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, not that they don't believe in its constructs. But let's look closer. The video talks about clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, but as a rule these groups do not use much of any personality test that sets out to measure normal personalities. They use tests that measure psychopathology. On the other hand, among organizational psychologists looking for tools to deploy in the workplace, the Myers-Briggs is popular. As Vox themselves say, it is in fact the most popular personality test in the world. Vox's argument is whatever the majority believes is right, which is of course a fallacy. Vox wants to turn truth into a popularity contest, but since the Myers-Briggs is actually the world's most popular test, then by their own argument, the Myers-Briggs must be totally meaningful. It doesn't work that way. Vox also tells us that the Myers-Briggs sorts people into types, but then claims Jung did not agree that people could be sorted into types. They state, but even at the time, he realized that most people didn't fit neatly into one category or another. He wrote, every individual is an exception to the rule. It is true that Jung's typology has differences from the system of Myers and Briggs. And by the way, Myers and Briggs were well aware of these differences. But are Vox right to quote, every individual is an exception to the rule, to argue that Jung would not have agreed that people could be sorted into types? Let's look at the quote in full. Although there are doubtless individuals whose type can be recognized at first glance, this is by no means always the case. As a rule, only careful observation and weighting of the evidence permit a sure classification. However simple and clear the fundamental principle of the two opposing attitudes may be, in actual reality they are complicated and hard to make out because every individual is an exception to the rule. Nowhere in this quote is Jung saying that people don't have a type. What he is saying is that it is hard to determine people's types, but that careful observation will nevertheless permit sure classification. So what makes for a good soundbite actually means the complete opposite once viewed in context. Vox also criticizes the practice of the Myers-Briggs of breaking the scales into halves. For example, in the Myers-Briggs you're either an introvert or an extrovert, whereas more scientific models prefer to work with a continuous extroversion scale. Rather than calling the first half of the scale introvert and the second half extrovert, there are just different degrees of extroversion, from the very low to the very high. Vox says that because the Myers-Briggs breaks the scale into halves, many people often get a different result when they take the test again. To back their claim, Vox cites a study claiming that this percentage is as high as 50%. Vox are correct about this. In terms of empirical testing, there is very little to suggest that people's extroversion scores are clustered as two camel humps and not as a bell curve. The problem arises because the Myers-Briggs attempts to hammer Jung's concepts of functions, which are very hard to test empirically, into a shape that can be tested. Be that as it may, however, the study that Vox is citing is from 1983. Now why is this relevant? It is relevant because the Myers-Briggs is continually improved by the statisticians and psychologists who work at the company that owns the test. According to their own data, the newer versions of the test are much more reliable, but criticisms like the one voiced by Vox almost always rely on these 30-year-old studies, conducted using outdated versions of the test. The company that owns the Myers-Briggs claims that for the newest version of the test retest reliability rate is now as high as 80 to 90%. This is very good since it is comparable to most other instruments or better. The company that owns the Myers-Briggs has released a lot of data that supposedly proves this, but other researchers are understandably wary of just accepting their data as offered in good faith. But the solution to this problem isn't to keep citing a study from 1983. It's to make new independent studies. Vox also mentions that Carl Thoresen, a professor of psychology who sits on the board of the company that owns the Myers-Briggs, has never published on the Myers-Briggs himself. Vox quotes him to say, I used it practically, but I didn't use it in any of my research, in part because it would be questioned by my academic colleagues. That was always a barrier. Vox calls this an admission, but is it really? The quote comes from a Washington Post piece on the Myers-Briggs, which used Thorson as a source. Right after the quote by Thorson, the Post follows up with these lines. It is a classic chicken and egg problem. No major journal has published on it, therefore no elite academic will support it, therefore no major journal will publish on it. And speaking about the data that the company has amassed, Thorson says that he thinks it should be publishable by the top-tier psychological journals. Thorson is not admitting anything as much as he is calling attention to a state of affairs which he believes is unfair. Is it unfair? Well, those same old studies that Vox used for their claim that the Myers-Briggs is totally meaningless also find that the 4 MBTI indices do measure aspects of 4 of the 5 major dimensions of normal personality, that the Myers-Briggs is effective, and that even critical reviewers see promise in the instrument. This would again suggest that new independent studies on the validity of the Myers-Briggs need to be carried out. In short, Vox's video says that the Myers-Briggs is totally meaningless, but it doesn't actually demonstrate it. In the end, the veracity of that claim is very easy to refute. The scientific gold standard with regards to personality testing is the Big Five. The Big Five measures 5 scales and the Myers-Briggs measures 4. And the 4 scales measured by the Myers-Briggs actually correlate with 4 of the 5 scales measured by the Big Five. So the Myers-Briggs clearly measures something, and that something is related to 4 of the 5 best constructs that we know within this field.